if we know the velocity at which a neighboring agent is moving, we can translate the VO by this velocity and symbol select a new velocity that is outside of the VO, right? That was the idea.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Looks like you have an audio problem. I don't know if your microphone is making some noises.
There is a...
it looks like there's an audio problem. It's noisy sometimes. I guess maybe your microphone is...
let me play. I don't hear any noise, but like at least in my room over here, there's no, I don't pick any noise. Like I don't hear any noise, but let me play a little bit with the... Better?
No, the volume is low now. Yeah.
So you're getting a lot of static noise, you mean, right?
Maybe the microphone was touching something, like your laptop or your hand. I don't know. It looks like it was touching something.
I don't even know where the microphone is here.
But it looks.
The sound is better now, but it's lower.
Yeah. The volume is low.
The noise is less.
Well, I deliberately lower the volume, but what about now?
So far, so good. Yeah, I will let you know if the noise is back.
Okay. Well, let me try to see if that happened when I sat down on the chair. Is it better?
Yeah.
Okay. Just let me know if things are, there are issues again, right? Okay, so, right, that's the idea. So I have now, I'm in the absolute space rather than the relative space. So the gray area denotes all forbidden velocities for A to take. Everything outside the gray area is safe to take. So I can formulate this as an optimization problem, right? I have a set of free velocities. I have my goal velocity, which is given to me. So I want to select a new velocity inside the white space, so to speak, which is as close as possible to the goal velocity, right? Simple strategy. I'm just checking where the goal velocity lies in the velocity space. If it is collision-free, well, I can take it, right? If it's not collision-free, let's make the assumption that that's my goal velocity. I just project it to the closest boundary on the VO, and this is a safe velocity to take, which is as close as possible to the goal velocity. Does it make sense? Okay. So no questions, right? Okay, so that's very easy to do since we only have one VO. We only avoid collision with one other neighbor, right? Now, things can become a little bit more complicated with multiple neighbors. And also if we want to add additional constraints, such as a maximum speed constraint or a maximum acceleration constraint for the agent. So a simple solution to alleviate this problem, and this is what actually you have to code for homework 1, is to sample the velocity space and select a velocity that penalizes collisions and the distance to goal velocity, right? And what is the issue with this approach? Well, this is a very simple approach. It can work well, but the issue is that it can be slow depending on the number of samples that we are going to evaluate. And you're going to see that in the assignment, especially in the assignment, I give you 3 kind of scenarios, 3 agent scenario, 8-agent scenario and what I call crossing scenario. In the crossing scenario, as the number of samples you evaluate per agent increases, the computation is going to be very slow, right? You're going to see that. And also, we cannot guarantee collision-free motion since we're actually rely on sampling, right? So these are kind of the issues with a sampling-based approach, right? Okay, so to circumvent these issues, the optimal reciprocal collision avoidance framework was proposed in 2011. I started covering this method last week, but let's try to revisit things and then continue with a complete description of the method. So let's get back to this kind of working example. We have agent A and agent B. We plan for agent A. And this is on the right, you see the VO. For the two agents, all relative velocities that are not safe to take. And this is a truncated VO, meaning that I actually account for time horizon. So I only consider relative velocities that will lead to a collision within a given time horizon, right? I could have not account for time horizon, and then the VO is going to look like a cone like this, right? So let's put some actual velocities, right? So this is, we have the velocity for agent A, right? Over here, the velocity for agent B, and this is the relative velocity, VA minus VB. As you can see, the relative velocity is inside the cone. Therefore, basically, the two agents head into a collision should they maintain their current velocities, right? Which you can see it also in the Cartesian space, right? You can visualize that if the agents are keep moving with their current at their current velocities, they're going to collide, right? Okay, so let the vector u denote the smallest change in relative velocity that is required to resolve the collision. And we can simply find this by projecting basically the relative velocity to the closest point on the boundary of the VO, right? Nothing tricky going on. I know that's my relative velocity. I project it to the closest boundary. This is the smallest change that the agents need to take in order to move the relative velocity outside of the VO, right? Now, if agent A was to take its own velocity plus that vector, and nothing else changes, then the collision will be resolved, right? Does it make sense? The relative velocity is inside of the VO. Agent A is moving with velocity VA. If with this velocity I add this smallest possible change that I need to avert the collision, then the collision will be resolved, right? Well, the problem with this approach is that we're going to waste a lot of effort, since basically each agent tries to avoid collision without accounting for the fact that the other agent is also trying to do the same, right? So this is going to lead to kind of like oscillatory motion, and we're going to waste a lot of effort, keep recomputing at every time step a new collision-free velocity for the agents. So to address this issue, ORCA basically introduces this notion of reciprocity. The idea here is that the agents are going to split the effort to avoid the collision. Basically, if that's my relative velocity, and that's the smallest possible change I need to take, this vector over here, to resolve the collision, I'm going to split that effort. Agent A is going to take half of that, and agent B is going to take the other half, right? So agent A, so to speak, will move the relative velocity halfway towards the boundary of the VO, and agent B also is going to do the same, right? So that's the idea here. So how do we do that? Well, basically, ORCA conservatively approximates the VO with a half plane delimited by the line perpendicular to the vector u. What is a half plane? A half plane is basically a region consisting of 4 points on one side of an infinite straight line, right? And no points on the other side. Basically, this infinite line, gray line that I have over here, splits the space into two half planes. The one on the right, and the one on the left. Any relative velocity to the right is forbidden. So anything here is forbidden. And anything to the left, so anything in this kind of region, is safe to take. Right? So that's an approximation that ORCA is doing. Instead of having a cone to denote the velocity obstacles, I actually going to have a half plane. So instead of having only these velocities over here, ORCA assumes all of these velocities are not, relative velocities are not safe to take, right? So let's translate this into, so talking about relative velocities, let's translate this into absolute velocities. Remember, agent A and B will share the effort to resolve the collision. That's the idea of reciprocity that ORCA uses. So if I, from A's perspective, if I translate A's velocity by half u, so add the vector u times 0.5, right? And take the line perpendicular to the resulting vector. Anything now to the right is a forbidden absolute velocity for A to take, and anything, everything, every velocity to the left, so everything here, is safe absolute velocity for A to take. Right? So this infinite line over here is what we call an ORCA constraint induced on A by agent B. In other words, agent B imposes a linear constraint on the velocities that A can select. And anything to the left of this line is feasible and denotes the set of permitted velocities for A in order to perform optimal reciprocal collision avoidance with respect to agent B. And this is what we call ORCA set, right? So formally, ORCA set is a half plane delimited by the line perpendicular to the vector u over here that passes through the point VA plus half u. So this is VA plus half u. I take the line perpendicular to that. In that half plane, all of these velocities are known as the ORCA set of permitted velocities that A can take with respect to B. And this is basically what this form tells us, right? This kind of like math that you see over here. Give me a second. This kind of math that you see over here, basically, I don't know why this is not seem to work. Let's see. And we'll get back to this. So the math over here basically tells you that exactly like this, all of the velocities that they are to the left of that infinite straight line are the velocities that are permitted for agent A. Now, give me a second, hopefully. Okay, so now if the goal velocity is inside the half plane, it is safe to take it. We can take this and we have solved our optimization problem, right? If the goal velocity is actually in the forbidden space, so if the goal velocity is the other half plane, right? We can find the closest solution by simply projecting the goal velocity to the ORCA line, right? And now this is going to be my new velocity to take. Does this make sense as a concept? I know it's a lot of geometry that I'm trying to convey here. I will upload the paper as well, but I want just, the general idea to make sense. Does it make sense? Right? So I have the cone. Instead of using the cone, I'm actually going to approximate the cone with an infinite straight line, right? I know that anything now to the right of that line is forbidden, anything to the left is free. We are in the relative velocity space. In order to move it into the absolute velocity space, I'm actually going to do the same, but I'm also going to account for the velocity of agent A, right? Now, this concept of ORCA can be extended when agent A has to avoid multiple agents. Consider this kind of scenario over here, where basically our agent A has to resolve collisions with a bunch of neighbors, right? Every neighboring agent imposes an ORCA constraint to our active agent A. For example, agent D imposes this kind of line constraint. Everything to the right of this constraint is safe. Everything to the left is not. Agent B over here imposes this line constraint. Everything to the right, so all of this area, and you can see this kind of like gray region over here, everything above that line is safe to take, everything below is not, right? So every one of our neighbors is going to impose one of those line constraints, right, in the set of velocities that A can take. Then the set of ORCA velocities for optimal reciprocal collision avoidance with respect to all nearby agents is the intersection of the half planes of permitted velocities, right? This is basically the set of permitted velocities that agent A can take. I'm going to take the intersection of all permitted half planes, right? That's the idea here. Does it make sense? Instead of having only one line constraint, meaning only one half plane of free velocities to take, I have multiple, as many as my neighbors, right? So I need to take the intersection of that, and that now defines my ORCA set of permitted velocities. So now, this is the optimization problem that I need to solve. I need to select a set I need to select a velocity from that set. I don't know why my pen doesn't want me to write down things, and I want to do that. Well, let me go through that slide, and then I may quit the presentation and start again. So I need to select, so let me use just the laser over here, a velocity inside the ORCA set, which is as close as possible to the goal velocity, right? That's the optimization problem that I have to solve. Unlike the single neighbor case, we cannot solve this problem just by vector projection. What we are actually, this optimization problem, basically what it is, we want to optimize the distance to a point subject to a number of linear constraints, right? I have this vector over here. I have a number of linear constraints, and I want to optimize the distance subject to these constraints, right? This can be solved using linear programming. And you can kind of like, if you want to visualize the linear programming can be viewed as I'm intersecting all these line constraints. By this intersection, I can actually build the convex hull of all of these constraints, right? I can build the perimeter of the intersection, right? And then I'm going to project the goal velocity to the convex hull. At that point, the closest one is going to be my new safe velocity to take. Does it make sense as a concept? Right? I have a bunch of linear constraints. I'm going to solve an optimization problem using linear programming. The idea here is basically I have all of these lines. The lines intersect. I'm going to get the convex hull of the intersection, right? And then I'm projecting, in theory, the goal velocity to the closest line segment of the convex hull. And that's my new safe velocity to take. So ORCA actually uses an implementation that adds, the constraints one by one in a random order while keeping track of the current optimal new velocity. And by doing so, the linear program can be solved in linear time, expected time. Where linear with respect to the number of linear constraints, meaning linear with respect to the number of neighbors that an agent has to avoid, right? And assuming that an agent only considers a fixed number of k nearest neighbors within a sensing radius, ORCA basically takes linear time per time step to compute a new collision-free velocity for an agent. So it's extremely fast because of that. Keep in mind how to select always nearest neighbors, like the scheme that you're using to select nearest neighbors can affect the overall performance. And again, you're going to see that in your assignment, where I'm proposing, well, you're probably going to use a naive scheme where you go through all neighbors, you compute the distance. If the distance is less than your sensing radius, so to speak, then you tag somebody as a neighboring agent, right? Note that we may want to account for some kinematic constraints, right? For example, here, this constraint is a maximum speed constraint. I can add that to the set of line constraints that I have and still solve the problem. And this does not really affect the performance. So, trying to put everything together, what you're going to see next is going to be a multi-agent navigation from the eyes of the red agent using ORCA. The white arrow over here denotes goal velocities, and there's a black arrow over here that denotes the new velocity that the agent is going to take. As you can see already, the green agent over here, or the green neighbor, imposes this green ORCA constraint. So everything to the right is safe to take. The blue one imposes this line constraint. Again, everything to the right is safe to take. If I take the intersection of the two half planes, this region over here is safe to take. And as you can see, initially the agents select that velocity in that region, right? And let me play this. Right? Let me play it again, one more time. This is using the ORCA framework, right? Every agent imposes a line constraint. I take the intersection of all of these constraints, and then I select the collision-free velocity inside that free space of free velocity space, right? Any questions? Yes.
Here we are just calculating the ORCA of agent A, right? Not all the...
Can you speak a little bit louder? Because now I cannot hear you guys.
So here we are calculating the ORCA of agent A only, right? Not the other agents.
That's correct. That's correct. By symmetry, well, yeah, no, that's correct. Because here we have like 3 agents. Yes. I only visualize what A is doing, but what the red agent is doing, but also the blue and the green agent are running ORCA, but you just don't see how they perceive the environment, right? So all 3 agents, they run ORCA, but what you saw, and I'm going to play it again, is what agent is doing in order to avoid collisions, right?
So for all agents, the ORCA will be order of n square, right?
For all, so for that specific agent, for the red guy over here, the complexity is going to be linear with respect to the neighbors that it has, right? So it has 2 neighbors, so it's the complexity is n, right? Every agent is run this independently, right? There's no centralized planner. Think of this, that's a robot, for example, right? Or that's a human being. Typically, you don't communicate, well, at least not explicitly, right? Maybe there are some social cues what you want to do, but typically you don't say to somebody else where you're going to go, right? You just go somewhere, and you try to infer what other people are doing, and you resolve collisions, right? Okay, so can you give me a second just to be able to see why I can not annotate anymore? We're going to see a bunch of more examples in a tiny bit. Just bear with me in a second to see why I cannot. Seems that that does not look good. I think like the battery of my pen has died. Give me one more second. That's gonna be problematic down the road. You can see it during the break. I can fix that. Sorry about that. Just let me do one quick thing. While I'm mentioning this, because I received a couple of emails from students and I forgot to mention that earlier on. Some of you requested the slides to be available before class, and that this is actually happening. So if you go to the course website, I'm usually posting the lecture PDF before the class starts, right? So you can follow things. Unfortunately, right now, my pen is not working. And anyway, let's move on and see later on what to do with that. Okay, so this is the same thing. Now in the circle scenario, again, I'm visualizing everything from agents, from red agents' point of view, right? And the approach can be extended to 3D, excuse me. This is the resulting scenario. We basically now have three-dimensional position and velocity vectors. And as I mentioned, the approach is extremely fast, and that's the main advantage of ORCA. What you're going to see next, you're going to see 25,000 agents simulate with ORCA in a virtual HUD scenario. Each one of these kind of like agents, but they look like dots over here. The motion of the agents is generated, so the new velocities of the agents is generated with ORCA. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, back then, I think like that was like 4 years ago or 5 years ago, even for 25 agents, we were able to get something like 5 to 10 frames per second. So kind of like to summarize, ORCA is a powerful framework for reasoning about collision avoidance. As it runs in real time, it can provide collision-free guarantees, and we're going to discuss this later on, and it is highly extensible. For example, here, we extended ORCA in order to handle oriented bounding box agents. So an agent now is not a disk. An agent now has an orientation. We approximate agents as oriented bounding boxes. So for example, here I have a triangle-based agent. The agent needs to navigate through that narrow passage. I approximate this agent with this kind of oriented rectangle. And this is the resulting scenario. And this is kind of like the resulting VO, where, as you can see, the VO changes and is much more complex as compared to the VOs that we have been seeing up until now. Because of the orientation, we actually now start having nonlinear boundaries, right? But again, I can use this notion where I can approximate this VO with a line, right? A different kind of example. Here, basically, ORCA has been extended in order to handle differential drive robots. What you're going to see 4 iRobots interacting. Each one of them is actually running ORCA independently while sensing and trying to avoid its nearby agents. Right? Okay, this is a different example. Here we extend ORCA in order to handle kinematic constraints of car-like vehicles. There are two types of vehicles. Well, I think let's see if this can run. Yeah, there are two types of vehicles, a simple car and a magnetic bike. On the right is the bicycle model. On the left is the simple car models. And this is using an extension of ORCA that accounts for vehicle-like kinematic constraints. Here is a simple car, so we have limited the maximum acceleration. Here is a bicycle, so to speak, model, or it's actually a compact robot with two magnetic wheels. And here we have maximum, infinite acceleration, but we cap the maximum speed. This is a different scenario. The orange agent over here is a dynamic obstacle. It does not react. So the blue agents, they have basically to resolve collisions both with respect to each other, but also with respect to the dynamic obstacle that does not react to anybody else. And this is a random scenario, number of agents, random positions, and again, they have to avoid collisions using this extension of ORCA, right? The source code of ORCA is online. It's literally hundreds of papers since the 2011 version that have been written based on this concept. It has been used extensively in robotics as well as in game industry. And let's now try to see a couple of things that are not so great about ORCA. Well, first things first. We may not always be able to find a solution. Consider this kind of scenario. I have my agent A in the middle, and the three neighbors are moving towards agent A, right? So these are the corresponding constraints that each of the three neighbors imposes to agent A. These are the safe velocities for AA to take with respect to D. These are the safe velocities for A to take with respect to B. And these are the safe velocities for A to take with respect to C. So if I take the intersection of all of these permitted sets, it's actually an empty set, right? If I take the intersection of this with the intersection of that, with the intersection of this, it's an empty set, right? So there's no free velocity to take. Okay, so the actual code of ORCA, how can we address this issue? One way, and the one that you see these days in the official library, is we can actually relax the constraints by removing one at a time further away neighbors. What I mean with this, I initially add all of my neighbors, I try to solve the problem. If I cannot solve it because there is no basically feasible set of velocities to take, then I'm gonna discard the furthest away neighbor. So now I'm gonna try to resolve collisions only with the two agents rather than three, right? And if that solves the problem, that's good. If not, I'm gonna keep doing that. I'm gonna keep removing furthest away neighbors from the set of neighbors that impose constraints on me. right? That's the idea. So I'm relaxing the constraints. I'm relaxing the number of neighbors that I want to avoid collisions with, right? That's the idea. Does it make sense? That's simple. It's a simple kind of like, it's a simple idea. I don't want to use the term hack. It's a simple idea, right? It kind of like, it a little bit makes sense. I mean, if you're in a really dense scenario, if there are like, let's say 20 agents around you, maybe you don't want to resolve collisions at the same time with all 20. Probably you want to resolve first collisions with the first 3 or 4 guys nearby, right? Initially. That's the whole concept here. The other solution is that we can actually construct the ORCA constraints assuming that the velocities of all agents are 0. So up until now, we have our own velocity, and we are, in theory, sensing the actual velocity of a nearby agent, right? If we assume that actually when we construct this set of permitted velocities, that our current velocity is 0, and the current velocity of each of my nearby neighbors is also 0, then ORCA is guaranteed to find a non-empty set for all robots in all kinds of scenarios. The idea is simple. If we are not colliding right now at this time step, the 0-0 velocity always lies outside of the velocity obstacle cone, right? If I'm not colliding right now, and if I assume that nobody else is moving, right? So everybody stands still, right? Always the 0-0 velocity is safe to take. So if I use this kind of approach in order, this assumption that all velocities, all agents are moving at 0 velocity, I can construct ORCA lines and I can solve the problem. This always guarantees that I'm going to have a non-empty set of free velocities, collision free velocities, because at least the 0-0 velocity is free to take. The problem with this approach is that the behavior, if I do that, the behavior of the agent is far from ideal. So in practice, and when you code things also in real life, we are actually going to use our actual velocities, right? So we're going to use our actual velocities. And if we do that, if we end up in a scenario that we have an empty set, then we have to relax the constraints, right? So in theory, ORCA can guarantee collision-free motion, but not in all scenarios, right? It kind of depends what kind of velocities I'm using in order to construct the ORCA constraints. In most low-density and medium-density scenarios, if I use the current velocities, the set, I'm going to find a free set of permitted velocities, but as the scenario becomes denser and denser, that may not be the case, so I may not be able to guarantee collision-free motion, right? That's the whole idea here. Any other issues? Can you think of any other issues with ORCA? So one issue was that we may not always be able to get a set of feasible velocities, right? Can you think of any other issues of using ORCA? Yes?
So here, when we're doing the ORCA for one agent, we're assuming that the other agents are also running the ORCA model if that doesn't happen, then would that change things?
Not necessarily. Well, it may change a little bit your behavior, but because remember, you are making this assumption that you're gonna split the effort to avert a collision, right? Let's say that that does not happen. The other agent does not do that, right? So that means that at the next time step, probably I have to correct my motion again. I have to take, again, a new velocity, right? Whereas, because the other agent did not react, right? But assuming that all agents are running ORCA under the hood, then I don't have to do that. But you're right. I mean, again, all of these kind of like proofs rely on the concept that everybody's running ORCA. But even if they don't, in theory, as I progress, I'm always trying to find a set of velocities that are safe to take, right? But behavior-wise, we're going to see some differences, right? Assuming that everybody around me is splitting the effort or sharing the effort versus only me is taking the action to avert the collision, right? Can you think of any kind of like other behavioral issues with ORCA?
Is it more like it's a reactive system rather than a predictive or proactive system?
It's a predictive system. Basically, remember we started about talking about predictive approaches, and the notion behind predictive approaches was time to collision. If I go back to velocity obstacles, remember, velocity obstacles is the set of all relative velocities that will lead to a collision at some moment in time, right? So time to collision is implicitly baked into the velocity obstacle set, right? So that's a predictive approach. But it plans directly in a velocity space. But that actually is a nice lead-in for another issue, right? ORCA conservatively approximates the cone, the velocity obstacle cone, with a line, right? So basically, instead of saying that only these relative velocities or only these velocities are not safe to take, I'm actually saying all of these are not safe to take, right? That means that we're throwing away too many collision-free velocities that an agent could have chosen, right? Like this white space, all of this white space that you see over here, we just throw it away right now. And we're saying only these are safe to take, only the blue region, right? As a result, far-off collisions are treated as equally urgent, and the behavior is kind of like what I call here too robotic. You see that the agent in the middle waited for the other two agents to pass around it before it reacts. Why? Because it couldn't find a collision-free velocity, right? It conservatively approximates the two VOs with two infinite lines. Because of that, by taking the intersection, the only safe velocity that it seems to find as collision-free is to stand still initially, right? And it gets this kind of behavior. And this is like how it looks like on actual robots. Same scenario, but now using a differential drive implementation of ORCA. Excuse me. At some point we'll start playing, hopefully. There we go. I saw something flickering. Come on. Okay, let me see if I can. Give me a second, just to see why this is not playing. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Well, it should have played, it's just like, it takes a little bit of time. So, let me go back. At some point, you're gonna see the agents moving. I think when we recorded it, we forgot to trim the video. So be patient. There we go. Same scenario. Again, the agent here at the back, at the rear end, is not doing something clever up until the other two agents, they reach their goals, right? Another problem is that because of that, again, approximation, because of that conservative approximation, agents can easily get trapped in local minima because they are too willing to go with the flow. What I mean with this, you have this kind of scenario, a big group versus a single agent, and they have to swap positions. So the group has to reach the yellow agent, and the yellow agent needs to go to where the group is right now, right? This is what happens. Well, it's collision free. It's collision free. It's just like it will never reach the goal, right? But it's collision free. So it's kind of like, we kind of like guarantee collision free motion. It's just like, well, we just disappeared from the screen, right? Well, eventually, what happens, I cut it off, like I basically cropped the video a little bit. What happens is at some point, the group reaches the goal, and the yellow agent is going to go around the group and appears back on your monitors and go upwards and reach its goal, right? But the problem is the same, right? If I play this again, well, all of these agents, they impose a constraint to the yellow agent, right? So it realizes that the only velocity to take is actually move backwards. Not even standing still in this case is a good velocity to take, right? So, let me do a lead in. Let's see how I want this to work. Let me say a couple of slides, and then probably going to take first a break a little bit sooner because I want to discuss this all at once. So to address this kind of issues, right, that we've seen up until now with ORCA, we can actually turn into how humans avoid collisions, right? There are many things have been documented about how we as human beings resolve collisions with each other, right? Basically, there's this notion of principle of least effort that says that people basically naturally choose the path of least resistance. It has also been well documented that interactions between pedestrians are anticipatory by nature, depending not only on the current state of the pedestrians, but also on expected future states, right? We basically anticipate collisions and react to each other future trajectories. Also, typically humans share the effort to avoid collisions. So the question is, to what extent we can actually formalize this kind of insights mathematically and generate a model, a human-like model for local collision avoidance? And can we actually do that? And I'm going to stop here. Let's take a break and resume at 5:15 and start talking about how we can actually try to use existing human crowd data in order to infer a local collision avoidance law or a local collision avoidance model.